First, as many of you, as I've said in the past, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the CMOS Ottawa Centre. I'm the current chair, and these luncheon talks for the last year and a bit have been virtual rather than live, and they seem to have been well received that way. So we're really pleased that people can join us today. I have a couple of housekeeping notes. Denis already mentioned he's shut off your video and microphone, and those will be turned on during the Q&A session, or allowed to, but we're not saying that you turn on your mic unless asked. We're going to do question format similar to the past. We'll use the chat function. You can type in a question as you think of it, and you may have a comment or a question, and it will help if you can enter it. But as we go along, it may generate a lot of potential discussions. So even if you put your name and say, I have a question, I have a comment, Len Berry will be orchestrating the Q&A, and he can go through the chat and see who has indicated that they would like to comment or question. And as we get into the question period, it may be that we ask somebody to give their question themselves. So we can do it that way, that they'll be invited during that period. So still put in things in the chat function to get started, and we'll see how it goes. I have every belief that this could be a very interesting talk from many that we've heard before. The other thing I'll mention, as the regulars know, this will be recorded, this session, and posted later on the CMOS YouTube channel. So I hope that, I'm assuming that if you're on this, you agree to that. So as I mentioned, Len Berry will handle the Q&A later, and I'd like to turn over the introduction to Ray Desjardins. Ray?
Thank you very much, Barry. I'm very pleased to present today's speaker, Dr. Alan Betts. He's a world-renowned atmospheric scientist with over 50 years of experience. He presently lives in Pittsford, Vermont. He worked very closely with Canadian scientists during the first International Land Surface Climatology Project field experiment over the grassland in Kansas, and that took place in the mid-80s, and the Boreal Ecosystem Atmospheric Study on the Boreal Forest in Northern Canada that took place in the mid-90s. During the last 10 years, his analysis of the hourly Canadian prairie data for the past 60 years has improved our understanding of the land-atmospheric coupling. This has been possible because of the 24 daily estimate of opaque cloud cover made by trained weather observers at many airports across the prairies. I still remember being trained in the early 1960s to do that kind of observation. He has published numerous publications on the climate of the prairie based on this data. One of his goals is to help society understand the challenges that climate change presents to humanity. Today, the title of his talk is "The Climate Crisis is Here. Why can't society deal with it?" This talk summarizes a paper that he recently published called Climate Change and Society. Alan?
Okay, Alan, I'm going to stop sharing and you can start sharing your screen.
Right, but I don't know where I am anymore. I'm not on this particular screen. All I'm seeing is the names.
That's all you'll see. You won't see people.
Yeah, but I don't have my screen visible.
At the bottom, probably.
No, it's not. I've got your data.
If you go to the bottom, then you'll see. Oh no, it's true.
You have to reduce the size of this screen so that I can see what's underneath it. Sorry.
Share the screen at the bottom.
Oh, that's the button.
Green.
Yeah. All right. We'll go back. This is my starting slide, and there's so much. I have the admittance buttons. Is that a good picture of my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. And I'll forget about the people who are up there who are waiting to be admitted.
I will take care of the admitting stuff, Alan. So you just share your.
I'm delighted to give this talk, and thank you to the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society for giving me this space. I mentioned this particular paper as something to pre-read, but I'm going to go beyond that paper in this particular talk. But let's get started. This is my sunrise as I went for a walk this morning, just to remind us, me, you, and everyone of the magnificence of the world that we are part of. I have only a few technical slides of the kind you're familiar with. There are more in that paper, but most of you will be familiar with all this. The Earth sustains life. And here's a picture of the Earth on, I think it's January the 4th. Yes, is a new NASA satellite. And that's me in my garden digging over my rye cover crop on the same date. And when I give talks in Vermont, it's very simple. I run through slides of this
Alan,
kind.
can I interrupt?
Yes.
The slides did not go forward.
This has not gone forward.
No, you are in photos. You're showing the photo and not your PowerPoint. You shared your PowerPoint and they shared your photo and not your PowerPoint.
Oh, well, how do I know the difference on that?
And
this is not going through by clicking the.
No, you're staying on the same screen. Do you want me to share the PowerPoint and then you tell me when to advance?
If you got it, and I'll just say advance, yes.
Okay, well, give me a second. I will bring it up.
That's because I know why that is. I don't have access to the screen underneath. Okay. No, when I play with it, I just get your screen back.
So give me a second here and I will share.
Okay, this is probably what I should be sharing. Is that better?
Yes. Now, can you go to...
Then I'll go through that.
Yeah, and you need to go to the button on the bottom. Or why don't we just live with that?
Is that right now?
Yeah, we're seeing all the side screens at the side as well. So if you go to at the very bottom of your screen, there is a button to go to slideshow. If you go on the red across the bottom, start at the right-hand side and you come along the plus minus, and then there's a little screen icon next to it, just next to the minus sign, to the left of the minus sign.
I don't have a minus sign, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Is this one working?
Why don't we go with that?
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was my opening one. That's why we can't deal with it. Yes. And thank you. This was just my sunrise this morning when I went for my morning walk, just to remind you of the beauty and interconnectedness of the whole planet. This is a slide, a technical slide, and just summarizing essentially the climate system. It's from a new NASA satellite, and that is me tilling over my rye cover crop on the same date. These are the kinds of slides that I have through the winters for the last 10 plus years in Vermont, now about 14 years, when it's been possible to dig in January, which for Vermonters is absolutely unthinkable. So it immediately, to a Vermont audience, tells them the climate system has changed. And you know all the details. The greenhouse gases on the first order keep the Earth warm, but as CO2 increases, there's an imbalance of energy. It's stored in the oceans. The evaporation of more water vapor triples the warming of the CO2 alone. Ice and snow then melt, particularly the Arctic warms and our winters warm, and that reflects less sun. And so that's a warming amplification. And the oceans store all the imbalances, and all the ocean circulations change as a response. And in addition, now we're getting increasing extreme weather, a lot more stationary weather as the westers slow down, as the Arctic warms, and the tropics are not warming as fast. The Arctic is warming at least twice as fast. What was the wake-up call for Vermont was 2011, when we had extreme record floods in the spring on Lake Champlain from the northern rivers, and then extreme floods with Tropical Storm Irene in the fall. But if you step back, this was also an example of a large stationary pattern across North America. And this is the type of picture we get from the US Met Service. With apologies, as you know well at Canada, these things are not continuous across the border. This is the ranking of the state precipitation for a 6-month period that included those two extreme events. And then 117 means that from Ohio to Vermont, it was the wettest 6 months on record in the 117 years we have records of. And the ones mean that New Mexico and Texas were the driest on record. So record drought, record wet, and the first of the big fires in Texas. A stationary pattern that was essentially stationary for 6 months, meaning that all the wave patterns with precipitation moved across the northern United States and presumably affected Canada as well. And you've probably seen some version of this picture. This is an extreme version from Scott Duncan of the Lytton, Canada, which broke the records on 3 consecutive days for Canada. A Canadian record that has stood for 80 years from a drought in Saskatchewan was broken by almost 5 centigrade after 3 days of warming, with this whole ridge in the stationary ridge in the west coast of the United States and Canada, where temperatures reached, up into the 40s centigrade, 110 for us people who still live with Fahrenheit. And tragically, that town was burnt on the 4th day. But it was part of one of many global quasi-stationary patterns this year that have given us real extremes. Extreme floods in Europe, massive floods in China, and massive Siberian fires, and on and on and on. So the outline of what I'm actually going to talk about is not the details of all these things, which many of you are already familiar with. I'm going to talk about the policy aspects. And climate change policy, if we can call that, is essentially dictated in the US and in many countries around the world, all in slightly different ways, by the rich and powerful. It's obvious that a global climate crisis has arrived. And what I'm going to say to you is that we really have to shift into the indigenous worldview of this planet, but that's something that's been ignored for reasons that we'll come back to that you well know. What I call the fossil empire, which is the corporations with fossil fuel interests, is essentially dictating policy. It's very obvious in the United States, but it's also happening in other parts of the world. And basically what the fossil empire has done over the last 40 years is create webs of lies to confuse the public. It's bribed politicians, and it's essentially lied about the whole issue for a long time. But behind all this is, why do we misuse human power so much? As in this example and others. And it's all associated with things that go back through a long period, a couple of thousand years. And I'm going to briefly go through that and essentially the history of the last 2,000 years in a couple of slides, a few slides. The misuse of human power was cast in our frame at the Council of Nicaea in 325 to satisfy the Emperor of Rome. It existed through the rise of Western science, and simultaneously we did everything we could to destroy the indigenous worldview that is incompatible with. Now, I got into this particular field about 45 plus years ago. I objected as a young scientist and as a professor then at Colorado State within the system, to the separation of science and policy. And I argued with Dave Atlas, that some of you will remember, the separation of science and policy was the traditional frame we were trained in. Scientists were trained, it helps protect the integrity of science against politics a bit, and it's invaluable for global cooperation. But I claimed back then, and there's a long article on my website, an expansion of this one, and I'll come back to that in this talk briefly, is that we cannot solve global challenges with this dualistic mindset. And then tracing it back, I discovered where it started, and I map out, as I will in this particular talk, how it drove the rise of science and is now driving the destruction of the earth. So to oversimplify, I realized science was not enough some 50 years ago. It needed some direct insight, some concept of wisdom, some concept of ethics and morals. So I went searching. And I'll come back to that also in a bit. If I look back one decade, a group met on Oregon's Blue River, and they cast the 2011 Blue River Declaration. And this is their summary of this document. They met for a few weeks. A truly adaptive civilization will align its ethics with the ways of the earth. A civilization that ignores the deep constraints of its world will find itself in exactly the situation we face now, on the threshold of making the planet inhospitable to humankind and other species. This is a framing in modern language of the indigenous worldview. And it's very different from our society's attitude, which is we're in charge, we can exploit the earth and its people for profit. And the reality is the earth is far more powerful, and that's the dilemma we are faced with in the climate crisis. The indigenous mindset that I'm going to cast, it's only one of many of the versions of this from around the world, of which I'm not familiar with everyone, but I'm familiar with a lot of them. This is in the Judeo-Christian world. And this is not what you learned from Christianity or probably Judaism if you come from that tradition. The indigenous Aramaic prophet that we call, whose actual name was Yeshua or Joshua, we know as Jesus. And there is a book called The Hidden Gospel by this author that will map out some of his actual teachings. And he framed these indigenous teachings not in terms of human power, but the understanding that the creator was within all creation. Or in our modern language, there's something about the nature of the creation of the earth-centered system itself. And his teaching was quite simple. It had nothing again to do with human power. It was to join with the creation, step into that world, and you can see the truth of the web of life, and you'll be set free to act on behalf of the creation, not human self-interest. Well, I'm going to tell you it's absolutely true, but it's heresy to power. But it's also critical to the survival of the earth now. Christianity lost this heresy, but Jesus himself, of course, was executed because truth, as he viewed it, is heresy to power. Christianity survived, massively persecuted by the Roman Empire, till the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when Emperor Constantine dictated the terms. His wife had been converted. Persecution will end if you destroy the Aramaic Gospels and keep the Greek, because the Greek understood imperial power, they understood warfare, and this established the concept of human power over nature for the next 1700 years. The Aramaic Christians, Jewish and Assyrian, became heretics. A million or so died in the next 2 centuries. And the persecution of the Jewish Christians in time became the persecution of the Jews. You weren't told that either. But the Roman Church carried this human power over nature through the Middle Ages and the concept that the priests with their power ruled the people. And if you're really, basically in this frame, the God was moved up into the heavens where he couldn't interfere with human power and particularly the priests. Science adopted this frame and rose with great success within this power over nature frame in the Middle Ages. Without moral standards or wisdom. And just an aside here, who's our most famous scientist? His name is not on my list. Oh my, oh my, oh my, oh my. The Principia gentleman. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. He was also a great, he understood what was called the occult. He understood all the things about the structure of the universe and the planets and the circulations and wrote about that. He was simultaneously understood the occult. That was carefully suppressed later, but it reflects where a lot of his insight, intuition, and inspiration came from. But of course, the Europeans, for 500 years or more, have simply traveled the world, exploited and killed the indigenous people for a variety of reasons, with church support, enslaved people, and you know all that story. European societies were controlled by the rich and powerful, and capitalism rose within that frame, again without moral standards. And for 70 years, until the rebellion of OPEC, the US controlled the global oil supply and price, and that fueled fossil capitalism and the exploitation of the earth and the poor. And I reference a couple of books here. Most of you will probably know that the impact of burning fossil fuels has been known for about 40 years. In the US, the Exxon senior scientist in 1978 modeled with some success and quite accuracy the doubling of CO2 on the global climate, told management, warned them they had only 5 or 10 years before they changed their strategies, and he was silenced. And the web of lies started: denial, shifting responsibility to individuals, bribing US politicians to deflect legislation. It's extraordinarily cheap in the US. It costs only $61 million to bribe 139 Republican deniers. And then you can still claim the government, not the oil companies, are responsible because you've bribed the government. But essentially, this is global ecocide by the fossil empire to keep their profits flowing, which are staggeringly large, with political help, and in the US, large subsidies. So I'm going to review the first half of this talk. Burning fossil fuels is transforming climate, and there are many water cycle amplifying feedbacks. Climate extremes are increasing, stationary patterns are as well: floods, droughts, heat waves, and fires. You know all that. There's been avoidance of responsibility for decades. And fundamentally, a stable climate is incompatible with what we call business as usual. I'm speaking specifically for the US. The fossil empire dictates the rules and bribes US politicians. And the underlying issue is the misuse of human power by technology and economics. It's soluble. We simply change the system guidelines, create an efficient society based on renewable energy. But that is essentially a moral choice, not one based on profit. The choices are value-based, and it requires essentially a shift to the indigenous worldview. And I flagged one of my newspaper columns at the beginning of 2020. We have to value the future of life on Earth above global ecocide for current profit. So I'm just going to take a detour for a moment to my own history here, so you can have a better understanding of where I'm coming from. In my BAMS article, I was arguing about the basic framing, and it was a much longer article than just this, that scientists should do what society says. And I had this little list of hierarchies of the allegiance of a researcher: planet Earth, mankind. Notice it's masculine language in the 70s. Science, United States, one's own science, specialization to a specific research contract. And I commented that most research owes allegiance only to the lowest level. That the society was in a mess technologically, clear evidence that assumptions were unsound, which were accepted by the scientific experts. And this whole thing was really a scientific fraud. Atlas, of course, did not agree with me, and my response to him is also on my website. So I went searching. Now, this some of you may find a little quaint. This is 1980. So I asked, it was actually a meditation teacher at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, how can science be merged with wisdom? And I was told, oh, go to Tiruvannamalai and ask Rogi Ram Surat Kumar. He would know. Now, in those days, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have this. You simply sent a telegram to some master teacher somewhere in the world, in this case, Yogi Ram Surat Kumar, Tiruvannamalai, India, and he would get it and tell him what time and date you were coming. And he would greet you. Well, I'm not going to go into that unless you ask me, because his answer, of course, was cryptic and a classic Zen koan. But it's a fascinating story. It will take me a few minutes to go there. I'm not going to there. But before I even saw him, I sat in the meditation room of another saint, Ramana Maharsha, and just slipped into a meditative space. I had been traveling across India. I was immensely relieved. 30 years after his passing, all was there, his picture on an Indian leather couch. But I was picked up within minutes. I was connected to all that is, the earth, the creation, taken through my life in a symbolic way that I can't possibly put into words for 20, 30, 40 minutes. And I came out absolutely ecstatic and joyful for days. I had seen something, this view beyond myself that I knew existed, but I had no idea. I had no concept that a place could be so sacred that all I had to do was surrender, note this world. And I discovered later that Ramana Maharshi's, one of his first phrases was, silence is truth. He wrote little, he said nothing, very little. There's nothing in Western terms, but if you step into his place and surrender, you are connected to all that is. I then sat with a living saint in India for a few weeks, and I was on my way. I learned about the indigenous teachings from Tselegi, that's Cherokee teacher Dihane Wahu here in Vermont. And later, much later, I learned about the indigenous Aramaic teacher known as Yeshua. Join the creation and see the truth that will set you free. And by that time, I knew that this was actually possible. So let's shift for this part of the talk to the Earth system frame. We have a fundamental choice, Earth system or fossil empire. Is an obvious choice, but how many really understand what it means? Okay, we accept it on the sense that the Earth is more powerful and will win this climate crisis battle. But if we step into the indigenous frame, then things change subtly as well as in the frame I'm giving you. If you think that the Earth is in charge, you need to connect deeply to understand the Earth, and I'll come back to that. For scientists, we need training because it needs surrender, which is a heresy to us. But I'm going to explore climate disasters the last few years from the Earth system perspective. And that immediately should raise hackles with some of you. What? The Earth doesn't have a perspective. We are the smart ones, and we're busy destroying it for profit. So let's just take a look at the 2021 climate catastrophes. We have no problem understanding they're not under our control, but suppose the Earth is selecting modes. And I'll start with New York City. August the 21st, Tropical Storm Henri came along, flooded New York City, set new records for rain rate and total rainfall for a day. September 1, 10 days later, the remnant of Ida broke those records again and flooded New York subways, roads, basement. From the Earth's perspective, this is just simply flooding the big cities in this case until the finance and the banks grasp that it's ecocide to fund the fossil empire. Perfectly sensible from the Earth's point of view. The Earth's question is, how long will it take? Let's take a look at Texas. Texas is the linchpin of the fossil empire. Thousands of offshore wells there and in Louisiana. The wake-up call for them was 2017 when Cat 4 Harvey came along, flooded Houston, damaged the wells, did massive damage. Very fitting from the Earth's perspective. I'll skip a couple of years. 2020, Hurricanes Hannah, Cat 4 Laura, and Beta did damage on the well systems. Category 4 Hurricanes Nicholas and Ida in 2021, damage again. And this remarkable March 2021 record-breaking Arctic blast that came down from some coupling at the stratosphere, upper tropospheric level over the pole, destroyed the power grid and the refineries. Some of them haven't been repaired yet. Very fitting. And from the Earth's perspective, since Texas will not close its oil wells, hurricanes must destroy them. And it's the same story for Louisiana. What we see, of course, in the press or the finance literature is this polite statement: the refineries in the US are not at capacity. It's a perspective that challenges us. It's obvious to the indigenous mind. It's heresy for us. If you look at other places around the world, you will see also in China, record problems with flooding. The coal mines are flooded. They have power problems. They were at the same time as that record temperature in the west on the Lytton in British Columbia. Those few days, we came close to losing the Three Gorges Dam, which is by factor of 5, the biggest dam on the Ganges River, biggest of all the dams in the world, upstream of Shanghai. And every day the simple question was, will it survive today? All the floodgates are open and it's flowing around the edge. And you probably know the Siberian fires are bigger than all the fires on the Earth. And for you, the question in Canada is, what will it take to shut down the tar sands? and start the recovery of the indigenous lands. These are a massive resource of bitumen and oil products. So let's revisit once more. The earth has no perspective or intelligence to protect its interests. That's us, humanity. And we're so smart that we're destroying it for profit. This is what our total misuse of human power is all about. And it's a good thing we're not in charge. We have to shift from this mindset with no values and connect directly with the earth. But we have no training. As I've mentioned several times, the key element of connecting to the earth system is surrender. It's not under your control. You cannot tell the earth you want to know blah, 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 blah. And I'm not going to be able to answer questions of that kind. You have to surrender. But of course, we've been trained from centuries of militarism, fight, fight, and never surrender. We have global crises. Here's just a perspective. The finance industry is waiting for economic growth so we can drive more destruction of the planet for profit. But there are troubling power shortages, really troubling. Refineries, as I mentioned, are not at capacity, and that's freeze and flood damage. Coal is in short supply, China and India. The Chinese coal mines, the big ones underground, have been flooded. Coal exports from Australia are down, that's a political fight. Gas shortages in Europe and fears of cold winter. And on a much broader scale, we have microprocessor shortages, and the dominant supplier of new chips is Taiwan, which is in a close feud with China. Manufacturing is scattered because we tried to find the cheapest place to make everything. The connectivity is crumbling. Global trade has crumbled. And in the US, shipping is simply waiting off the West Coast. And a totally different issue that I'm not going to talk about at all is how do we deal with the protests by youth and indigenous who have every right to stop business as usual from destroying the earth and stop the rich and powerful from killing their children. And this is becoming a conflict issue around the world, of course. So this is my second review. The climate crisis needs new perspective. It needs an indigenous perspective of the earth, which is difficult for us. We can analyze the physical climate system and we can model it after the fact, but it now appears the earth is selecting modes to damage our fossil and industrial infrastructure. But if we are willing to take even one step towards the indigenous perspective, it strengthens our ability to stand against the fossil empire and business as usual. And it does something much deeper. It starts to feed us inspired choices through intuition and serendipity and deepen our web of connections with each other. And in fact, that's what I'm going to leave as my final slide before one I have for questions. And this is my suggestions to you, all of you that are listening. Discuss this talk in local groups and listen carefully to the spread of different reactions. There will be many. Ask who feels connected to the earth and would like to explore deeper on behalf of your group and report back to you. Encourage and support them, preferably at least two, diversity and male, female, whatever you have, of course, all of you are different. And there's this little article I referenced earlier, which basically says, step into the indigenous worldview and goes through some of the process. And see how your group dynamics change and your relationship to the earth and your relationship to all the things that matter for your science as well. Because this type of step connects you not just to the earth, it connects you to everything that is. And, I have talked for barely 30 minutes, so we have lots of time for connections, correct comments, and I have one other slide we'll come back to. So someone else take over. Are there questions out in the mysterious web on paper? Len.
Thank you, Alan, for a very, very interesting presentation, provocative and thoughtful. We are welcoming questions and comments on the chat. Right, I'm just ask one. We don't seem to have any at the moment, but I'll ask one myself. You at the end, you mentioned that the Earth is selecting modes to damage our fossil industrial infrastructure. That's a little, yet before you had sort of talked about the Earth is not consciously acting here. Can you just reconcile what you mean by the Earth is selecting modes to damage our fossil? Like, how do you see these? It's like Gaia is not a conscious entity, but it is certainly a well-balanced ecosystem, right?
Okay, well, let me put on my last slide. And you asked, is the Earth a conscious entity? And of course, from our worldview, it's not, absolutely not, but it is. And we don't understand that type of consciousness, but every time I have connected to it, and I'm just going to go through one more example. And I make it very blunt so you all understand I'm saying something that is really radical and you should ignore me if it's, this is heresy. Am I saying that the Earth can bypass the laws of physics? You're asking, is it conscious? That's a different question actually, but they're interrelated. And the answer is yes, because creation is responsible for the physics, and it can if it chooses. Now that's absolute heresy, but I've experienced it directly. So I'll spend a few minutes, since it's actually, we have a lot of time, explaining the example of how on an individual level, the Earth has intervened in my life. This is a specific example, and I explain the context. I'm sitting in the Adirondacks. I'm on a vision quest. I'm 3 days by myself, and I'm sitting on a vast rock beside a rushing stream, all alone. I've been alone for a day or two. I settle into a deep, peaceful state. I had no concept of the world around me other than I was in a deep meditative state beside a rushing stream, and I had 3 days alone. And the Earth intervened. So the Earth, on some level, is watching. I was receptive. I had surrendered to a very deep meditative state. I'm just sitting cross-legged on a big rock, a huge rock, 15 feet across. And without me, I'm not requesting this. This just happened. But I was in a surrendered state that I immediately, and I would read immediately when something happened that it was the Earth itself that was conveying to me a very specific message. Now, again, I explain the context in a moment because I knew exactly within a minute or two what was going on. I was actually picked up. Now that's physically impossible. I'm sitting on a rock, and I was not only picked up, I was picked up with beautiful elegance from a cross-legged position, perfectly uniformly and smoothly. And my hands were going up, so I couldn't use my hands to get up, but I was lifted up, picked up, lifted up, something that you can never, is not possible from a simple physics point of view. My weight was redistributed in a sense uniformly through my body, and I was picked up. And I was picked up, and I went immediately into a dance form, what in the indigenous tradition is called a dance to the 4 directions. It was similar to one I had been trained in by the school that I referred to earlier, but it was precisely different. And all I could do was, I wasn't exactly smiling, I was absolutely stunned. All I could do was dance. I could opt out, I had that choice. But of course I did not make that choice. I didn't know where this was going. For about 40 minutes, until my body couldn't take it anymore, I simply danced this absolutely precise dance, and my body knew exactly what to do. My intellectual mind looked at this, because I'm watching all this absolutely 100% consciously, looked at this and said, well, perhaps I should capture this. But every time, and I only tried twice, to actually turn on, in a sense, the part of my mind to memorize this specific dance, I could feel it start to slip away, so I stopped. Now, the context here is that I, in my scientific worldview, would hear native indigenous teachers say that they were sitting somewhere and the Earth gave them some new dance, and they would then teach it to us. And my human scientific mind said, well, they're brilliant, they understand all these issues. They sat there and they created it. They were a part of the process. I wasn't part of this process at all. The Earth said, essentially knew what I was thinking, said, you should be shown how it actually happens. when I, the earth, decides to do something. And I learned the lesson perfectly. But it's an example of this issue that the earth has a type of consciousness, which is an interconnected web across the earth. That part I know nothing about the details of. That's far vaster. But on the individual level, the earth is also watching us, which means that the individual, including yourselves, who actually goes out and sits and surrenders through some kind of meditative process that you're familiar with to what's beyond, you might get messages. The very first message you get will stun you. I mean, in this particular case, for 24 hours, the entire world around me shimmered, and because I could essentially see into the living creation around me by this stream.
Thank you, Alan, for that. That's nice. That's really impressive.
Yes.
Let's start on some of the questions. We have a question from John Reed. How to make the transition? For many years, fossil fuel companies have received government subsidies to encourage investment in resource discovery. Now government action on climate change is leaving them with stranded assets. Please comment on what seems to me to be an interesting parallel with slavery. In the UK, slave owners were compensated for loss of their property, while in the US, a civil war ended in no compensation and repercussions lasting to the present day.
Yes, well, that's a lot of questions.
That's a long sentence.
That's a long sentence. Well, let me just, yes.
How to make the transition.
How to make the transition. Well, there's clearly an intelligent way to make this transition, and the fight over, which is classic of the US. I have a memory problem. Perhaps the audience, I should mention to the audience, the way in which Britain got out of slavery for the British Empire was radically different than the US. It was one of the first nations to ban the slave trade, but the slaves and the plantations were all over the British Empire in different roles. And a Black Baptist minister, whose name is just below the surface of my fading memory, in Jamaica, said, it's time we did something about this. And he called out 60,000 slaves in Jamaica on Christmas Day. He was a Black Baptist minister to those 60,000 slaves, asking just for half pay. That was treason, treason. And he was arrested, went through a legal system. He wasn't just shot. And that took many months. And he was executed for treason. But all the people, important people like William Wilberforce and others in the UK came and talked to him. And he said simply, I'm willing to give my life, but we have to free the slaves. We can move them into indentured servants, but we cannot just treat them as hereditary slavery and hereditary. And the British government within 1 year weighed these issues and weighed his testimony, and they decided a stepwise process that took 5, 6, 7 years, the rest of the 1830s, because I think his Christmas Day was Christmas Day 1831, mapping out, depending on how critical the slaves were, how they could be freed as indentured servants. And on day one, hereditary slavery was canceled to tell them that we were serious. And you can do these things in intelligent ways. But we have to have something other than the political system in the US that we have at the moment. Maybe you can show us an example in Canada. There are fragments of your system that surely you have more faith in than I have at the moment in the deep corruption. The way I frame most of the US system as a classic example is the struggle between truth and lies. And we have an absolutely overwhelming webs of lies at this point. Deliberate webs of lies, the whatever it is, the super lie that Hitler, the great big lie that Hitler himself coined that phrase to entrap people. And the US political right has accepted it. Hitler as a ruler, but the truth and the truth that sets you free versus the webs of lies is so fundamental to our political system. And we can't solve that question the speaker raised within that framework. We have to do it within a cooperative framework
Yes.
and ask what is the best and smoothest way to go through this transition and take the power and the money away from the fossil fuel empire and use it for the transition.
Which brings to mind the whole process that is going on this week with the biodiversity meeting in China and next week in Glasgow.
Yep.
There is a mechanism for cooperation. It's a question of whether the players will cooperate.
Or whether they will cooperate on paper, but there will be, it's still going to be up to individual countries to stand up and say, this is unacceptable. We have no right to destroy our children just so you can make $1 trillion in profit for the next 10 years, which is basically what we have at the moment.
Yes. So Alan, we have two other questions here. One by Ray Desjardins and one by Robert Jones. Let me, Ray, start with Robert because it follows on from the discussion we just had. Can you give some concrete examples of how we can move toward the indigenous view of the earth? This is really, and comment, this is similar to reconciliation being pushed by our Prime Minister with all talk, no definite things we can do.
Right. We understand, and you're going through this, I know, in Canada, that we did everything we could to destroy their worldview. And we had tremendous success. And that goes back, you have to understand behind that, I mean, one of the clearly guilty parties that's very difficult for them to deal with is the Christian religion, which all the way back to Nicaea, that discussion has to be taken by the Christian church, because that was the fundamental separation that meant that indigenous thinking, which was Jesus's thinking himself, was heresy, because it did not respect human power over the creation and the world itself, which is the fundamental essence of the indigenous mindset. The indigenous mindset, and I'm nowhere close to being an indigenous person, understands that if you live, they live in that world, they understand that world. And their elders also can step into that world in a more conscious way and essentially tap into earth system level wisdom, which none of us can, typically.
Yeah.
We can know it exists and make an effort and realize it needs surrender. It's not under our control. But that is something, I've lost my track of thought, actually. The question was?
Can you give some concrete examples?
Concrete examples
from the indigenous view
to the indigenous
how we
view.
Move towards the indigenous view.
Yes. Well, you have to, and some get, I mean, it's taken me decades to be able to say what I'm saying now relatively clearly. I suspect that many of the younger scientists who are here will have a closer understanding, because also, in addition, it is your future that is at stake. And the issue here is, there's the whole issue, where does your strength come from? If your strength has some connection with the earth, even if it's in the superficial way, then you are able to stand up and say, this is utterly unacceptable that we're destroying the planet for profit. And if the young people like the Extinction Rebellion or one of these groups that simply shut down London, we don't have anything like as much in the US, around the world, that was started by very smart, thoughtful people. You don't send in the troops to gas them, you say, yes, they are right. If they're shutting down the banks for funding the fossil fuel empire, they're right. Those banks should close. And of course, you have the power as the government to tinker with what they are allowed to invest in. And destroying the planet is not something we should allow our banks to invest in. But in the financial world that says profit, 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 that's an unacceptable thing to say. But we have to stand up and say that. and a few of you in the scientific world here may also stand up because you're respected members of society. But that's...
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And there is already a movement to move banks towards greener investing and more Earth system
There is.
awareness, which is the former...
We have to push on all these levels.
Yeah.
And the more visionary your understanding, the more visionary your solutions you'll come up with. This is not if you stay closed in a world and afraid, or one of the things that's been happening to our children and our society is the rise of mental illness associated with climate change and the fear of climate change. And there's a new book, which I don't have the name of here, by Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist saint, on dealing with climate change that recently came out. I haven't read it. I only read about it this morning, but I know him. And there are books of that kind, and all of them have one step into a frame of world that is different, indigenous. I ran into a teacher here in Vermont just a few weeks ago, and she understood our relationship to the natural world. And I said, where'd you get it from? And she says, I was in Japan and I got it from the Shinto tradition. So I have confidence that wherever you step in the world, the deeper you go, you will find an indigenous tradition that has had radical impact on that society, even if it's in some cases been ignored.
Thank you, Alan. That leaves us with a strong message in the philosophical and strategical directions that many of us perhaps have not dwelled upon. Let me go back to Ray's questions. He has two. They're more Earth system mechanistic, but I'm sure that they spin out under your message. The first is, water vapor is an important greenhouse gas, and how does the impact vary from year to year? And the second one is, do you think that planting trees in Canada is a reasonable way to fight climate change?
Dear Ray, I can't answer these on a quantitative level. The struggle over trees on a global scale, as you know, is that one of the shifts we've been trying to make is towards wood products for heating in various forms and stripping trees to do that. I mean, I burn wood myself, and there are trees I actually cut down myself that are dead in my own garden. I cannot answer questions about tree planting in Canada. You understand the forest system and situation, and also the challenge of the changing climate system. You know, we are stuck in, quote, preservation of the past in a situation where what is changing is very fast. And from the perspective of my talk, the Earth system itself is making decisions in the face of what is going on. It recognizes the preservation of life on this planet and the ecosystem of the Earth, as the climate is rapidly changing, is a huge issue. So, within which us humans have a very limited perception. So my suggestion will be go for diversification, not be too wrapped up in what was an indigenous species when you understand that the climate for northern Canada, northern central Canada is going to change by many degrees in the next decade or two. And you'll have to use your judgment. And you might have to sit, Ray, in the wilderness and ask for guidance.
Well, on that note, I think it's fitting to turn the floor over to our chairman of the CMOS Ottawa Centre to thank you, Alan.
Thank you for listening. And you can always get back to me, at least for a few more years.
Barry, can you take the floor?
I can, but Len, there's a couple of other questions came in.
Well, they
One, I
don't
believe,
seem-
from Peter
haven't
McKinnon.
popped up on my,
I'll read it, Len.
yeah, go ahead. Oh,
Okay,
oh,
from,
yes. Oh, yes, we have a
you got
couple
it?
of more here.
Okay, carry on, Len.
Yeah, sorry. Don Conway asks, to be pragmatic, how does one move from a deeper understanding to policy changes that benefit Earth?
You'll have to work on that one. Every country is different. Every political system is different. And I can't give you answers to that. I can see how difficult it is in my country. Bolsonaro in Brazil is facing this particular challenge at the moment. And so are many other leaders around the world. Your own leader, that I think the issue that I would really push his face into is what, yes, is he going to protect the indigenous against the tar sands development? And how can he possibly justify the tar sand development except in terms of pure mercenary exploitation in a fossil fuel world? It's one of the major sources of fossil fuels, and everyone who's done the analysis in terms of future climate says we have to leave the majority of the fossil fuels in the ground from now on. And the new developments that are going on and the rationalizations for the developments, both in the gas industry and the fossil fuel industry, and in yet another world in new fantastic nuclear power units that we can, are all unacceptable in terms of the survival of this planet.
Okay, let's move on to a couple other questions here. Peter McKinnon says, I have a question. From the big picture perspective, are you advocating a kind of Gaia hypothesis? I know that from James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, there came a great discussion over a period of a couple of years about whether he was suggesting a conscious Earth system or just a complex Earth system that we should better understand to the involvement of biological systems and etc. So Gaia came to mind as well when you were talking.
Well, I'm familiar with the work of that period and James's work of that period, and it's certainly a similar kind of framing. The challenge for us is how do we frame and understand an Earth system that is so complex, so living, and it's clear we're still the mechanistic, biochemical stage, trying to understand some of the ways in which the Earth system is able to do things that, a decade or two ago, we had no idea about. The way in which a big tree can actually feed nutrients, not only to its own children, but to also others that have beneficial side effects. We can understand those now, quote, scientifically, but all that has been going on since the beginning of time. So, and somebody used the word conscious in the context of, I went off on a theme there. Our concept of conscious is the way we think. And the way we think, which is human-centered, related to our own neuroses, related to our own wants and desires, very little in our world, different in the indigenous world, not that interconnected with all of our people around us. And it's obvious, say, in the United States, where freedom of the individual is the jargon, the mantra, even though it means it may destroy your children, the people around you with COVID, and on and on and on. Our consciousness is what's locked up inside our brain. It's not fully connected to the rest of the world. And so understanding an Earth system where it's clear that there's webs of interconnection everywhere what I'm saying on a global scale, I cannot provide you with any evidence for. I can see on the individual scale when the earth has basically tapped me on the shoulder and say, learn this, that there's obviously a kind of intelligence there that's vaster than mine. It can go back into my mindset and my past and my history, but it's not what we consider conscious, which is actually typically locked up in the individual human brain and not properly interconnected to everybody else, unless you're an indigenous person. So I've forgotten what the question was, of course, but the
Gaia hypothesis.
The Gaia hypothesis is part of that view, James Lovelock's view of that of a decade or two. And you can work it around in circles and try and define it in some way. But the reality is vaster than that, but it encompasses it.
Good. So moving on, we have another question here from a long commentary question by Vladimir Diaz, who's been following the amazing job done by the science community on climate change and ecological crisis identification. He was inspired by many of these people who took explicitly political positions and became activists. I think they overall made an incredibly important scientific contribution, says Vladimir. I also noticed that many of them, like the presentation today, moved into discussing some political, social, and economic issues after unproductive discussions with neoclassical economists and policymakers. So, however, I do think there's tons of valuable research written before the 1980s that can help. We should push and engage with those. Vladimir, if you have a very specific question to top that off, I would ask you to come on and say something. But basically, however, there's tons of valuable research written before the 90s that can help. We should push and engage with that. The move from science to political, social, and economic issues and action.
If that's, I'm coming from a climate scientist perspective, but if you're working in that world, then obviously what he says is right. You should read all that stuff and sort your way through it and see where certain particular threads came from in the historical thread and which ones were ignored or suppressed because they were incompatible with the political system. But I have not read all those. I mean, you can see from my talk where I've essentially summarized 1,500 years of history in 2 slides. I got a little bit of that published in that, and you can guess correctly that the reviewers gave me flack for it. But one was willing to make some helpful suggestions because I had oversimplified something, you know, in the 15th century.
Yeah.
And I haven't had time to read any of the things that he is referring to about the economics of the last 50 years, say.
Yeah, I really appreciate the presentation. I was just noticing that I think it's really important for the natural science community to engage with the social sciences and with the void that they have left in the last decade. I think there is lots of very valuable empirical research that was conducted some decades ago in relation to some economic processes, some historical economic processes that seem now, after some years of research in the natural science community, that has been pointing to, for example, the Industrial Revolution as important breaking points. I'm thinking about Paul Crutzen and his original discussion about the Anthropocene, or some of the Will Stephen's discussion about the planetary boundaries and all of that literature that has been talking so much about the Industrial Revolution and the so-called Great Acceleration. So I do think that there's tons of old scholarship and old literature or old research that was produced, particularly by historians, that will be very valuable to engage with in this new and these new discussions. I do appreciate, however, what many of the natural scientists, particularly climatologists and Mr. Betts today are doing. I do think I really appreciate that engagement with the political issues. I have been so supportive of, for example, I remember reading James Hansen's book, and I forgot the other climatologist who died a few years ago, discussing with the neoclassical economists, neoliberal economists, to say it in other terms, very frustratingly saying that it's impossible to talk with these social scientists. They cannot understand that some of the issues are just like the profit motive of how some of the economic processes work are just directly against the natural processes we are observing and we are trying to analyze. So I do think that's
Vladimir,
really
Vladimir, you know what your job is. You'll have to do this synthesis.
Well, yeah, I'm working on something like that for my country. I'm actually doing research about I'm trying to connect this literature of the Anthropocene and the planetary boundaries with the socioeconomic transformations that took place in my country. I'm from Bolivia. I'm speaking from Bolivia, but I am a PhD candidate in Carleton University in Ottawa. So industrialization, urbanization, the generalization of trade, the creation of national markets, all of these old issues that were the focus of so many specialists before the 1980s. I do think that there's tons of valuable empirical research that has to be brought back to the discussions, and that I think is the social scientists' contribution to the amazing job that the natural scientists, climatologists, and biologists have done over the last few decades.
Thank you. Thank you. You'll have to do a lot of it, though. The parts you understand, particularly Latin America. One of my nephews lives in Bolivia, so.
Oh, that's interesting.
But that's another story.
Thank you for that, Vladimir. I think we're slowly running out of time. Sorry about.
I think you've lost your web. Oh, you're muted.
There you go.
Larry.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say that we are sorry about the losing some of those questions. I didn't scroll properly. We have now, I think, come truly to the period when we should stop. We're running out of any questions. I will read a statement by Helen Joseph, which is along the lines of thanks, fascinating talk with ideas to take away. And they're so poignant for us to reflect on during this time in Canada on our deep discussions on truth, grappling with truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous population and broader contexts of climate. So I will pass you on to Barry Goodison now, legitimately. I don't see any more questions. And thank you very much, Alan, for a very stimulating.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And culture-bearing talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. Again, from everybody who was on the call, I think you've stimulated people to think outside the box, their own little box. I know from experience when we were working on Boreas, we had to work very closely with Indigenous peoples to do that research. And that was eye-opening for many of us of just making that contact and beginning to understand how they viewed the earth and the system around them and how we as scientists viewed it. So it puts a different perspective on a lot of the science we do when you have that involvement. And it's something we're doing more and more and getting much better at, of having from the very beginning of a project of engaging other scientists, indigenous people, and bringing elders in and understanding. So we've had that. You and I have experienced that, Ray, who are working on that project, and that was really great. So thank you very much, and I'm sure people will be stimulated in their thinking. So the last thing I want to mention is for those that are familiar with our regular talk series, the next meeting is going to be on November the 18th, and Dr. Stefan Gruber, University of Ottawa, will be speaking to us on permafrost climate services as a way to frame the research in the permafrost network supported by NSERC. So to everyone, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, and thanks again.